How engaged do you think your constituents are? How aware do you think the average politician or the average citizen is with local politics as compared to national politics?
Well, we're certainly seeing newspaper readership decline, certainly seeing a lot more being done on iPhones and iPads and terminals, computer terminals to see laptops, what your news is. We're not getting the kind of information that we used to get 25 years ago. In fact, newspapers were even wider and bigger and heavier. We used to have a business section once upon a time that was multiple pages. So I would say that most of my constituents are relying on social media, and it's sort of a selective process of what you want to actually read and know about. And so it kind of focuses more on the national level than the local level.
I think that's very true, and I think that's one of the challenges that we have with social media, because you can leverage the digital information, right? You get the digital information superhighway to get something out to a much larger audience. Advertisers are obviously more interested in a wider audience. The platforms are built up for this. It doesn't seem like we have a great mechanism for sharing the information of what's going on in the local situation. You, about 5 years ago, gave a speech, or a very short segment, about 2.5 minutes actually, on public access television, in which you brought up the idea of accountability or responsibility. You were discussing legislation that was being introduced that was proposed that there would be a report, right, with the conclusion of this. And you brought up a really great question, one that I don't have an answer to, and I'm not sure if it's been answered for you. How do we measure accountability in the public sector? How do we think about, we pass a law, we do something that establishes a standard that has to be followed? How do we decide if that standard has been met? Who's held responsible for it?
Great question, Mike. I even did a bill just to have the state have a CFO. Just who runs, there's no CEO.
Right.
No it was actually a COO is what I was asking for. Cities have city managers, counties have county executive officers. State of California, has a governor who has cabinet secretaries, who has Department of Finance, and maybe it's got some balance with the legislative analyst office. But yeah, who's looking at the big picture? Why does Caltrans have 3,500 architects and engineers too many, and why aren't they being moved over to help schools start planning their next building project or something? Or why aren't they even laid off? We don't have that kind of managerial structure. We have to tell departments what to do through bills. I'm no longer an executive, I'm a legislator now. But that takes a year to tell a certain department to follow a certain format or prepare a certain report. So it's sort of an awkward way to run a state, especially one with 40 million people.
Well, the analogy is used in financial markets, right? The Federal Reserve talks about the dynamics of interest rate cuts, or monetary policy as working with long and variable lags, right? The idea being you are operating a shower handle at the very top of a building, and the water heater is 40 floors below, although it's unusual in California to see that height. And the lags are perverse. That's magnified when we start talking about governing by legislation, because by the time something needs to be done, or we're made aware that something needs to be done, it's almost inevitable that the problem is so large that it can't really be solved.
And so now you see it manifested. Poverty rates, unaffordable housing, homelessness, all these things that have just kind of been growing and growing and growing. And here we are trying to react as quickly as possible as a legislature, as best we can, with some kind of, I wouldn't say superficial, but very limited legislation to try to address certain things. And we're not getting to the right answers. We don't know how to deal with people that are severely mentally ill, that are on the streets. They're walking around. We would never let someone with Alzheimer's walk around on the streets. We haven't figured out how to free up the marketplace to build housing. We don't have housing because we have a lack of supply, but we have a lack of supply because you can't make a profit. You can't, the amount of time you need, the amount of infrastructure fees that you have to pay to your local city, at the end of the day, it doesn't pencil out. So why should someone go through all the hassle if you're going to break even on the project? So we haven't figured that out, and we have to deal with a new leader every 4 to 8 years, And so, yeah, it's an interesting paradigm.
Who, to your point, is not actually a leader in the executive sense, right? They're not. They don't have key performance indicators that they're being held to standard. Their compensation is unchanged regardless of the underlying performance. They may get voted out of office, but that compensation pales in response to everything else.
Correct.